Anything else? Or?
I don't think so.
There we go. Good morning. I'd like to get started. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate you participating in this. Very excited about today. I'd like to start by just a little story. I happen to be a fan of science fiction, as many of you in the audience may be. The reason why I like science fiction so much is not so much about the shoot 'em up kinds of things, but I really like authors who envision future technologies and then really dig into the social aspects, the social impact of new technologies. So for example, one of the authors I like is a guy by the name of Larry Niven. In the 1960s and 70s, wrote a series of short stories called Tales of Known Space. And one of the technologies that he envisioned was teleportation, the Star Trek transporters. And basically there were telephone booths that were all over the world. And you could go into a telephone booth and teleport to any other place in the world where there was a telephone booth. And so he envisioned things like flash mobs, which we've actually kind of experienced a few years ago with the social media, where people could say, hey, we have a celebrity in this location, and people would converge on that location. Except in Larry Niven's stories, you could flick in, and you could have a flash mob of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people come to a location literally in minutes. And what are the implications of dealing with that kind of crowds coming together? He also addressed murder and how you would investigate murders when somebody could flick in, commit a murder, and flick back out. And what kind of evidence trail was left. And it's a whole different way that we would go about investigating murders today. So why do I mention that? Because we are living today in one of those kind of new technologies that has emerged in the last 10 years or so. And that is the ubiquitous connectivity that we all have. All of the devices we carry that are connected to the internet, we have unlimited bandwidth. And it's created some really wonderful things for us in science and technology and medicine, but there's a really dark side to it as well. And we're starting to see the impacts of some of this, and it's very, very relevant today. The new game in town is all about influence and misinformation and manipulating sentiment. In the old days, we could, as parents, we could control this somewhat. We could tell our kids what television shows they could watch or not, right? We can't do that anymore. We can't prevent them from being reached by the bad actors. And it's being done in ways that none of us ever envisioned, like the creation of games that they have access to that can be used to influence our young people. And so that's why I'm kind of excited to have Victoria here today, because this is her world. This is where she comes into play here. So Victoria, Dr. Victoria Romero is actually one of the 2 chief scientists at Next Century. And she's kind of well known in the community in this field. She has a master's and PhD from Claremont University in cognitive psychology and a bachelor's from University of California, Santa Barbara. She's well known throughout the DARPA and IARPA communities. She's done a lot of work with the US State Department and the CIA in this field to help agents of our country to detect, understand, and mitigate some of this influence that's going on around the world. So I'm really pleased to have her, and I'm fascinated every time she talks. So thank you very much, Victoria.
Thank you.
Please welcome.
Can everyone hear me okay? Yes? All right. Good. Okay. I don't always wear a mic. This is more for Virginia. I usually can shout loud enough that you don't need to worry about it. So thank you. Very, very nice introduction. And yes, just a one brief little addition to how I ended up where I am. I took a little bit of a circuitous route. I started out as a psychology professor, but even before that, I went to graduate school to study false memory. That was my original intent, to go to graduate school to learn about how people remember things that didn't really happen, and how we might be able to tell the difference between a real memory and a false memory, and what kind of factors come into play in creating false memories. And then I left that area. I went on to study infants and cognition and a bunch of other things. And it's come around full circle now, just within the last year or so. All of a sudden, I'm getting a lot more questions again about false memory, and why people think things that aren't true, and why they remember experiencing something that didn't really happen. And a lot of very basic cognitive psychology concepts that I studied in school, and at the time I was thinking about things like study skills and how to teach people statistics better. Turns out that they're very core. They're very key to everything we can do. And although technology has been moving at a rapid pace, the human mind is pretty much the same as it's been for thousands and thousands of years. It hasn't kept up. And so the interesting interplay between what's happening with the way that our minds work and how it's handling technology is going to be what we're talking about today. Not sure where I can point this. You can do it the old-fashioned way. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, as I mentioned, our psychological vulnerabilities are not new. Everything that I'm going to talk to you about today is a fundamental aspect of human cognition that, as long as we know, has been there since prehistoric times. What is very new is that bubble down on the left with technological advancements. Sorry, your right, my left. And what's even newer and really critical, just happening in the last few years, is a really quickly shifting geopolitical context. And these three different factors are coming together in a way that they haven't come together in some time. There have been times in the past, but the technology is what's different. So we're going to see how the things that are happening are not in and of themselves new, but they're happening at a much larger scale and a much faster pace. Oh, and let me not skip this. Over here, I've got the front cover of the journal Science from about a month ago. The journal Science, there's Science and there's Nature, and those are the two preeminent science journals in the world. So when you see something on the cover of Science, it's not pop psych, it's real stuff. And this is a study that says how lies spread, you probably can't read it, on social media, false news beats truth. And this was a meta-analysis looking at a number of different studies about how false information spreads across the internet. And it debunked a few assumptions that folks had. One thing that people think is that bots are to blame, that it's bots that are pushing out all this disinformation and spreading it. It turned out that wasn't true, it was people. Bots spread truth and lies in about equal measure, which kind of makes sense if you think about it. A bot doesn't care. A bot doesn't care what's true and what's a lie. It just spreads. People, on the other hand, favor some information over others. And as the study showed, they favor spreading the lies. Now, they don't know they're spreading lies, but there's something about the lies that is more engaging and more likely to cause people to want to spread the word. So that's a little scary. You put out the truth and the lie is going to make it further faster than the truth is, all else being equal. And the other thing that they found was that it wasn't particular to any one kind of person, right? It was people of whatever political persuasion and all education levels. There wasn't any special group that seemed more responsible. You did find a higher rate among the really core conspiracy groups of people. You still have quite high rates among everyone else. It wasn't as though there was some group that was above it all and didn't spread any of these misinformation. That wasn't the case. So as much as we'd like to blame out groups, as much as we like to blame the bots, it's not them, it's actually us. It's like it's everybody in this room and everybody like us. So there is a real body of psychological literature now on this concept of truthiness. Now, yes, Stephen Colbert invented the word. He invented it in 2005. But he invented the word for a concept that psychologists already knew about. And it turns out it's just a nice word. It helps encapsulate this concept of the fact that there is a difference between something being true and something feeling true. And what makes something feel true is not what makes it actually true. In fact, in some cases, it's the opposite. So the things that make something feel true are that it's easy to understand. And easy to understand could come in a lot of varieties. It's something as simple as it's a recognizable accent. It's your familiar hometown accent. If you compare that to an out-of-town accent, you're actually more likely to believe the familiar accent. You don't know why. You don't know that that's why you believe it. It's a little easier for you to process. You don't have to think as hard about it when you're hearing it, so you're more likely to believe it. You can tell the difference between fonts and different reading colors. And then from there, start to imagine if you're talking about a simplistic explanation versus a dense scientific explanation, or a simple explanation versus some sort of policy explanation. And you start to see where you can get real differences in terms of what people are going to favor, what they're going to feel like feels right by how easy it is to comprehend. Something else that makes something easy to comprehend is that it fits with what you already think. It doesn't challenge you. It's familiar. Either you've heard it before, or it's analogous to something you've heard before, and it's easier for you to incorporate into your set of knowledge already. That's going to make it feel more true. Taking that a step further, something that is consistent with your worldview. So we'll talk about worldview a little bit more in a minute, but the idea of how the world works in your mind, that the world is a fair place. Perhaps maybe not everyone thinks that, but for some people that's their worldview. If you think the world is a fair place and you have some incoming information that fits with that, that feels right. You're going to take that in and be more likely to believe it. And then this last point is important, and this one is particularly important with regard to technology. The first thing you learn about a topic is very, very sticky, and you will feel like that's the truth. That's the stake in the ground. So if you come to a topic with no opinion, just neutral, the first thing that you learn becomes the truth, and then anything else that comes along afterwards has to challenge and supplant that. So I can give you lots of references and studies now. There's a married couple named Schwartz and Schwartz who've actually done a lot of great research in this. So I guess we thank Stephen Colbert for the word, but it is true that, in fact, there is such a thing as truthiness. So when I work with the CIA or I work with the State Department, I have long lists of all the different kinds of biases and interesting phenomena that we see and how they can impact persuasion and susceptibility to influence. I can never go through all of them in any one particular session. That's too much, and that's fine. So I tailor them to whatever that particular group might be interested in. So for case officers, for people that need to persuade on one-on-one or get certain behaviors out of people, we might talk about compliance. We talk about things like obedience and group norms. If we're talking about sort of messaging to large audiences, then we'll talk about how to understand your target audience and segmenting and things like that. And in this particular presentation, because I'm going to focus on susceptibility to disinformation, I'm going to focus on a group of cognitive processes around schemas. A schema is a really important concept in this area. So I'm going to go through several layers of schemas and show how they build up from things that are very simple to things that are very dominant in your thinking. So the first thing to understand is where a schema would even come from. So a schema comes from exposure. It comes from repetition. It's not usually something that you've learned explicitly. You don't sit down and learn a schema. It's just something that you absorb over time by being exposed day after day, year after year. I've got an example over here on your right. Of 3 different television shows that aired from, I think, about 1980, like 1978, 1980, something like that. I've actually never seen that one. Will and Grace, of course, from the 90s, and one right now from Modern Family. So these are all about 20 years apart. And the reason that I thought those up there is because a few years ago, the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage, and it felt to a lot of people in the country like that had been a pretty sudden turning point. And legally it had. I mean, even I think only less than 10 years before that, California, one of the most liberal states, had voted not to legalize it. And so we had gone from the most liberal state voting not the most, but one of the most liberal states voting not to legalize it, to the Supreme Court legalizing it for the whole country in fewer than 10 years. And so that did seem like a very sudden shift. And like I said, legally it may have been, culturally not though. And I think sometimes what people don't realize is that the exposure to the idea had been growing for a long, long, long time. Decades, generations actually. So in that first television show, there was one gay character, Billy Crystal, and I mentioned I hadn't actually seen the show myself, and probably YouTube or something. I don't know that much about it, but I do know that he was not the central figure of the show, and he was kind of one-dimensional. Like that was his role on the show was to be the gay guy. That was it. And then you come about 20 years later, so that's late 70s, and then we get to the mid 90s, we have Will and Grace. So 20 years later, and this is probably the next big show that had prominent homosexual characters. And now this time it's got more than one. That's different because now you can have different personalities, you can show different aspects, and they were central characters. And it wasn't the only thing the show was about. They had full lives, right? These were full characters, but they still remained single on the show. It took until 20 years later in Modern Family, where you have 2 gay men who get married and adopt a child. And I think they might have, I don't watch the show regularly, I've seen it, but I think they might have another child, I'm not sure. But the point being that in that show, they're shown as just one of 3 families. And so it's normalized to a greater extent than it was in either the other 2 shows. And I certainly am not trying to say that it's because these 3 shows were on and we legalized marriage, but to show that this is how slow that progression went. And this is an example of exposure over time. And obviously there was exposure in a lot of other realms of these 3 shows. But I wanted to make the point of how long it took. And that's because sometimes when I'm working with the State Department or groups that want to do strategic communication campaigns and make these massive societal changes, sometimes I worry they think they're going to make a message and put a message out there and then come back next year and they'll see their progress. And say it's not that it doesn't work. It just, you have to understand how it works. It works at a slow, subliminal level over long, long periods of time. And it has to integrate itself into people's internal schemas and become familiar. And as it becomes familiar, then it becomes something that people can entertain and think about without throwing up psychological defenses. Now, I will say, this does not mean that if people don't like something, that if you show it to them often enough, they like it. That is not what it means. In fact, if somebody doesn't like something and you show it to them more, they probably dislike it even more. This is when something is, again, just neutral. You don't have a real strong feeling one way or the other. It's just the idea that the repeated exposure makes something more familiar. And the more familiar it is, the easier it is to think about. And this is, in fact, one of the key fundamental principles underlying advertising. when advertisers are trying to get your attention, yes, they'd like you to believe all the nice things they're saying about their product, but that honestly is the icing on the cake. Really, it's just to get you familiar, just to make you familiar with the product. So when you go in the store, you might buy the generic cola sometimes, but only because it's cheaper. Has anyone ever found the Coke and the cola the same price and decided they'd get the cola? You would never do that. And why? You don't have any particularly good reason, but you probably think to yourself that the Coke tastes better, but honestly, you've probably never had that cola, so you don't really know that. It's highly unlikely that you're going to buy the cola if it's the same price as the Coke. You like Coke more because it's more familiar. You've been seeing those cans since you were a small child, and your brain responds to it differently than to that other brand. Same thing happens when you go in the 99-cent store and all the brands look not quite right. Kind of looks like saran wrap, but it's like brand wrap. And you sort of, it's just that difference between the real brand and the funky off brand is that feeling of familiarity that makes you like something a little bit more just because it's familiar. So it works with Coke and it works with people and it works with concepts too. Okay. So now, here's another, moving on with schemas. This is a little exercise. It's going to seem a little laborious, but it'll pay off. I'm going to ask you to try to remember the steps in this process and think about, could you actually carry this out? Like if I was to give you this instruction and then take the screen away and like next week you had to go do this, would you be able to do it? So first you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that's the next step. It's important not to overdo things. It's better to do too few things at once than too many. In the short run, this may not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well. At first, the whole procedure would seem complicated. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places. Eventually, they'll be used once more, and the whole cycle will have to be repeated. Anyone think, yes, totally I could do that? It seems hard. But I only have to give you one little additional bit of information. And oh, yes, of course. So, okay, now could you recite it word for word? No, but could you give me a pretty good summary now? Yeah, pretty good. Why? Because now you have a schema for it. When I first gave it to you, it was a bunch of words. You had no idea what I was talking about. But all I had to do was show you a picture of a laundry basket to make it click. And so that is what a schema does for you. A schema organizes your knowledge. It makes it much easier for you to understand what you're looking at, to remember things, and to be able to reproduce it. It also, by the way, will cause you to remember things that are not in it. So I don't have anything up there about a dryer sheet, for example. But if I was to come back next week and I stuck a little sentence in there about a dryer sheet and I asked you, like, what part of here is new? You would have a really hard time with that. Because that fit with the schema. Now, if instead of sticking in a bit about a dryer sheet, I stuck in a bit about, I don't know, a microwave or something, then you notice that wasn't there. Because that doesn't make any sense. And so you will remember the parts that are not schema consistent. But the schema consistent stuff, that, you know, I can slip things in, I can take things out. As long as it still fits the laundry idea for you, it'll sound like it will make sense. So you have schemas for everything you think you do, from very low level things like doing the laundry to very complex things like spirituality and political and everything in between. And you get them. Sometimes feel like you learn them, and you might learn specific facts, but they really become schemas through experience. So you would not get this schema about doing laundry by reading about how to do laundry. You get it by doing laundry. So now that I've sort of, oh, and actually let me give you one more example, because it's one that actually usually helps people think about schemas. When they're not familiar what happens, going to a restaurant is a really classic one that they use in psychology. And there's different varieties, but pretty much everyone in here knows what to do when you go into a restaurant because you have a schema for it. You know, you go in and one of two things happens. You either go to the counter or you sit at a table and then order food at the counter, or a person comes by and order food. You know what the stuff is. And when something doesn't fit that schema, you suddenly become disconcerted. So I don't know about maybe the first time you went to Chipotle, for example. You walk in, it's like, people are lined up funny. Like, I don't understand what's happening here. And then if someone was to say to you, though, oh, it's like Subway, but for burritos. Okay. That's like giving you the laundry basket. Now you understand what to do. Where you'll find you really notice when your schemas are violated is when you travel, because all of a sudden your schemas don't apply to anything anymore. So the oddest restaurant experience I had was in Japan, where the service is phenomenal. If you've ever been to Japan, you know that you feel criminal for not being able to tip because you've never had better service anywhere in your life. So I was real surprised when I went into a restaurant and I sat down and nobody came by for a long time. That's weird. Usually it's such fantastic service. And finally I realized it was me, because people were going to a little machine in the corner. It kind of looked like a cigarette vending machine. You go there and you punch things in and a ticket comes out and then you took it to somebody. It was this whole process. I had never seen anything like it in a restaurant. So it was me, the one that was sitting there, dumb American, didn't know what to do. That's because I had no schema for that. It was completely outside my restaurant schema. And in those circumstances, everything you do becomes a lot more difficult and confusing and tricky. And we don't feel comfortable. We don't like when things are violating our schemas. So now I'm going to take you through some of the ways that schemas impact information processing and what makes them so powerful in terms of persuasion and disinformation. So identities. Identities are really powerful schemas about how you think about yourself and your place in the world. We're going to talk about each of these in turn. Sacred values, what you value in terms of your morals and beliefs, your worldviews, your ideas about how the world works, and related to that, master narratives, stories that tell you how your culture operates and what's important. So to go to each of these, identities are how we see ourselves in the world. And everybody has a multifaceted identity. So among the folks in here, some people are next century employees, some are not. That's part of your identity. Some are men, some are women, fathers, mothers, sisters, sons, brothers, all those things. Maybe you're a member of a rugby team. Maybe you went to a NASCAR race a couple weekends ago, but those are all different things that might be part of your identity. And which identity is at the forefront of your thinking depends on the circumstances that you're in. And you can think of them like different schemas. And you remember things differently depending on which schema you've got active, right? So if I can make you think of yourself temporarily as a national security employee, and I give you information, you're going to hear it and process it and remember it in a different way than if instead I was pulling up some other schema that lies within each of you. Of course, you're all different, so I don't know one in common, but your rugby player schema, you're gonna remember it different if you're in rugby mode than if you're in security mode. And in the US, that effect is pretty subtle. You do see it. You will see it. The most extreme place you'll see it is in what's called stereotype threat. In stereotype threat, a group there's a stereotype that their group does something poorly, and can cause a person to perform poorly by reminding them that they're part of that group. So for example, with math, if you've got a group of men and women and you give them a math test and you have been talking about something that has nothing to do with gender and you give them the math test, they'll get one set of scores that'll be pretty even across genders. If instead you do something before the test that's about gender, it could be, showing pictures, it could be talking about differences between men and women, something along those lines. And you don't say anything about math and gender, you're just talking about gender. If the math test scores come back, men outperform women. And it's not ability, because in the control condition that didn't happen. It's because they have put themselves in the mindset of the identity that they associate with a particular characteristic. And as a result, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And like I mentioned, that does happen in the US, but in the US, we have pretty cohesive identities. In more collectivist cultures, identities are more fractured, meaning that there's a bigger difference between how you feel in your home identity versus your work identity. And you can even see physiological differences in some of those groups. People will actually have different blood pressure and different physiological stress responses depending on which identity they have on. And I mention this because that means that when you're considering how a person's going to absorb a message, you can't just look at the message. You can't even just look at the person. You have to look at the full context and understand which identity are they likely to be in when they're encountering this message. So is someone at home with their family, or are they away at school, with a radical group all around them? It could be the same person, and they can perceive the same message really differently. Remember different parts of it, and convey it on in different ways as well. So this is a place where sometimes we talk about how one means to persuasion isn't necessarily even in the message itself, but in how you're getting folks to think of themselves. So, okay, Austin, let's see if I can figure this out. This, right? Thank you. So, funny that John was talking about sci-fi, because the example I'm going to show you is from Independence Day. But it's an example I show to illustrate how you can shift an identity in someone in just a few minutes. We won't watch the whole thing, but we'll watch the good part. Yeah.
Good morning. Good morning. In less than an hour, aircraft from here will join others from around the world. And you will be launching the largest aerial battle in the history of mankind. Mankind, that word should have new meaning for all of us today. We can't be consumed by our petty differences anymore. We will be united in our common interests. Perhaps it's fate that today is the 4th of July, and you will once again be fighting for our freedom. Not from tyranny, oppression, or persecution, but from annihilation. We're fighting for our right to live, to exist. And should we win the day, the 4th of July will no longer be known as an American holiday, but as the day when the world declared in one voice, we will not go quietly into the night. We will not vanish without a fight. We're going to live on. We're going to survive. Today, we celebrate our Independence Day.
This should be working again.
Oh.
If you didn't notice that.
So you all now feel a little bit more like an earthling than you did 10 minutes ago. So this is an entertaining example, but it actually demonstrated to work as well as many similar examples. That something that simple, it's well done. It's a Hollywood version of a inspiring speech, but something like that can shift you into thinking of yourself like one thing or another, and then that in turn is going to change who's in your in-group and who's in your out-group. And if you shift that, then you're going to be changing who do you show preferences towards, who are you showing benevolence towards. So the ability to understand all of the identities available to you in your target population, and the ability to be able to tune that in a way that might help your message can be really powerful. It's also something to watch out for what the other side might be doing. What kind of identities are they playing on? Whoops, what happened?
Major. Sir. Good morning.
Okay. Go. Down arrow? Nope. I can do it without the slides if I have to.
Sir. Good morning.
Where's phone? Oh, I see. That wasn't that from PowerPoint, got it.
Slide presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Need to get out slide presentation.
There we go.
Go down one slide.
There we go. Okay,
There
thank you,
we go.
everybody.
There you go.
Oh, all right, thank you. It's okay. I should have known better when I tried to use a clip. Just a technology company. It would work. I don't know. All right. So moving on now to sacred values. Sacred values are those values that you hold at a deeper, more visceral level than most. And it's a spectrum. So you've got everything from trivial values to pretty important to you values all the way down to sacred values. Those that have crossed into the sacred territory are actually processed different in the brain, and you can feel that. And the best way for me to show you what that means is to show you an example, which is a little uncomfortable, but that has to be or it won't work. So if you look at this list, I've got a range of statements that you may feel one way or the other about, and regardless of your position, probably there's some on there that you couldn't care less about, and there's some on there that you feel really strongly about. And the one on the bottom bothers me so much that I don't even like, it's pixels on a screen, and it bothers me that it's there. I sometimes can read it out loud in a talk, and sometimes I can't even say it. And if you feel like that, like you're like, oh my God, she put that on the screen, that's sacred value. Because that's where something has crossed over the line for you from just being a strong belief that you could make a good argument for into something that's really visceral. And it turns out that those are processed differently in the brain. And there might be more than one up there for some of you. So for some folks, being pro-choice or not, belief in God, things like that might rise to that level, and can be different for different folks in the room. Now, for things like, I'm going to assume nobody's going to hold I drink Coke at a sacred level. For something like that, although I think there might be hardly people that might be at that level, I'm not sure. For something at that level, it's processed in the part of the brain that does sort of oralize, like reward and thinks logically about costs and benefits, makes a logical decision. The things towards the bottom, as you move down the chart, start to leave that part of the brain and kind of just bypass it altogether, and instead are operating in the emotional parts of your brain, the amygdala and cingulate cortex, the parts that generate fear and anger and disgust. So those are the areas that are active when you're imagining violating sacred values, or when someone suggests to you that you violate sacred values. And so it's important to understand that those reactions, it's not that they're logical or illogical, it's just that logic is not part of the process. It's gone straight to emotions. And yes, you can certainly apply logic on top of it as to why that thing is a bad thing, but that's not where your reaction comes from. I think I already said all this. And the reason that this is so important is because not everyone in the world holds the same sacred values. And so a value that I believe is probably a sacred value that all of us find very hard to understand, but which might be at that gut level for some people, is honor killing. So imagine if you've got a population that if they see a line on the screen that says something about, you know, their daughter having sex out of marriage or in some way shaming the family, that they felt like we do about the pedophilia line, and then you try to tell them they're wrong about it. Now, I'm not saying that I believe they're right, but I'm trying to get you to feel like their point of view and how likely you are to convince them with a nice logical argument. But can you imagine a logical argument for the pedophilia line that someone could, oh, no, it's okay because of this? No. You're so far past that. And in fact, it will backfire and just make you mad. And that's exactly what happens. And the absolute worst thing it turns out you can do, they've done all research on, you know, for a while, how do we change sacred values? Turns out nothing has worked. Everything you do to try to change them backfires. And the absolute worst thing of all that you can do is appear to offer somebody a reward, money or some kind of a benefit or something for violating or changing the sacred value. That backfires completely. It makes them dislike you. It makes them further entrenched into the value that you're trying to plant. So they've actually demonstrated this with Palestinian territory. So with both sides of the fence there, with Israeli sacred, that is a sacred value in that part of the world, whether Palestinians have a right to land there. And so if you start offering money and rewards, it backfires. They've also seen that with Iran's nuclear plants. If you talk to Iranian folks, and there are some that have to the sacred value level the belief that they should have the ability to have this kind of defense for their country. And you say, well, okay, but we're going to give you these other, you know, we'll give you all this international aid, you give this up. That sounds to some of them like you're paying them off. Just like if I was going to pay you to endorse pedophilia in some way. So if you're in a position at some point where you can't understand how someone would think a certain way, go back to that. And it's not to say that their point of view is right or wrong. It's to say that that's kind of beside the point when it comes to how they feel about it and how they're going to react when you give them different options. This is now building up into more and more complex schemas. So the next level I'm going to talk about here are worldviews. So worldviews are your schemas about sort of just how the world works at a broad level. So I've got three versions here, and we'll think about how they explain an event differently based on which one you might hold. So let's say that, let's say your next door neighbor has smoked, you've noticed him smoking, and then you find out he has cancer. If you're the kind of person who feels like the world is just, people get what's coming to them, you're gonna kind of interpret that as like, well, that's sad, but I mean, he smoked, he got cancer, you know? On the other hand, if you're more of a fatalist, you know, what's meant to be will be, kind of inshallah sort of an attitude, then you're gonna think, well, it wouldn't matter if smoke, not smoke. If this is what the plan was, this is what the plan was. Finally, if you're more of a believer in perpetual strife between good and evil, then you might be inclined to think tobacco companies, they have it in for all of us. The tobacco companies, it's their fault. It's the evil tobacco companies. They have it in for all of us. It's conspiracy, or maybe you blame somebody else, but point being that you find there's somebody else to blame. Somebody did this to him. It's the bad guys. And so there's 3 different ways to interpret this thing that happened based on how you think about the world. Here's see if this works. This is a demonstration to show, oh, there it is, okay, that these dots are moving the same way, regardless of what shape is put there. But those shapes are schemas. And by placing different shapes over those dots, you perceive the dots to be moving in different directions. They almost sometimes seem like they actually switch direction midstream, right? From the triangles to the squares, all of a sudden they kind of flip, start going the other way. And that's because the way that you're explaining the motion to yourself, the way that you're explaining that sort of chaotic pattern is because of the schema that you're applying to it. And that's what worldviews are, but at obviously a much higher conceptual level. Worldviews are what help you take all the random data that life throws at you and put it into a picture that makes sense. And if you think you're seeing squares moving one way and somebody else is seeing triangles moving the other way, it's not that one person's right or wrong. You're just coming to it with different worldviews, and so you're therefore pulling completely different information out of it. Okay, and the last level here, went too fast. Master narratives. So master narratives are the stories that live inside of cultures that come up again and again and again. Not every story is a master narrative, but many, many, many are, and the really popular ones are. And master narratives are familiar to everyone in the culture. So Star Wars is a pretty classic one. Here's a set of movies that are all underdog movies. In fact, lots of movies in the US are underdog. And I have had a really hard time thinking of a sports movie that's not an underdog movie. I've thought of one that's kind of an underdog, maybe Squishy, not sure, $1 Million Baby, like iffy. Every other sports story I can think of is an underdog story. And that's a really key part of the American psyche, right? And other cultures have underdog stories, and theirs are a little different. They have different flavors. In an American underdog story, the underdog always wins. Or that's why I'm kind of iffy $1 Million Baby. Pretty much always wins. And if we don't, you don't feel satisfied, and it's unexpected, right? That's not true of Mexican underdog stories. In Mexican stories, their underdog will kind of resist oppression, but usually not overcome anything in the end. And so these are teaching us different things. It's teaching Americans that you, little guy, fight, you know, you've got enough spirit, you can win. And in Mexico, it's more about the oppressive, you know, federal or whoever it is that's oppressing the common people. You know, you can fight, but probably you're not, you know, this is the way life is. And it's sort of teaching the cultures different ways of proceeding through life. And why this is so important is because you can tell a really elaborate story really quickly if you tap into a master narrative. So when I just said underdog narrative, I didn't have to say anything else, and you already know the whole plot. Whole plot of like a 3-hour movie, you know, the whole thing. And so I could tell you something and call up all the parts of that. I could get you to feel empathy for somebody. I could get you to understand that somebody is a bully and that you're rooting for this. All of that just by a few phrases. And I can do the same thing if I'm talking about star-crossed lovers or fish out of water. I mean, I just say those and you know the whole story right off the bat. You can't do that for everything. You can't do that for being John Malkovich. No idea what that story's about. But now think about how hard it is to tell somebody what that movie is, right? You can try and you can kind of get it down. There's a closet, you go in, and next thing you know, you're in this guy's head, and then you pop out on the freeway, and it doesn't convey well, and the person's not going to be able to remember. These, on the other hand, get them like this, and then you can pass the story along really easy. In the time and place of tweets and Facebook, that's pretty important. I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time, but I just want to get to, this is the last really key thing I want to get to. All of these build up into a theory that's been playing out in the real world now for the last 20 years. It's not a new theory, it's from the 80s, but it has become so well demonstrated. The terror management theory was not originally about terrorism. It actually turns out to apply well to terrorism, but not exclusively. And this is the prediction that when people feel a threat to their worldviews, that they react in some specific and kind of scary ways. And those ways are increased in-group and out-group biases, regardless of the source of the threat, by the way. It's not necessarily just that you have increased bias against the one who threatened you. It's any out-group when you feel threatened. Movement to more extreme positions, more vigorous defense of those worldviews, rejection of shades of gray, and preference for stronger iconic leaders. Does any of this sound familiar? This is happening all over the world right now. So back to where we started, that this is our current geopolitical context. So it's happening in Europe in terms of right-wing nationalism. It's happening in the places of the world that are threatened by extremist groups, which actually includes us because we perceive that we're threatened by extremist groups. It's happening in parts of our country where people feel like their way of life as a blue-collar manufacturing worker is under threat. It's happening in places where people feel like their religion is under threat. Any part of your worldview, a piece of your key identity that you feel like is being threatened in some way, triggers this reaction, and it becomes a vicious circle. Because when it triggers a reaction in one person, that person becomes more extreme, and then they trigger it in somebody else. And so it seems to have been escalating and cascading around us for 10 or 20 years now. And we've got loads and loads and loads of examples of terror management theory operating at the local, national, and global scales. Oops. I realize I'm going to have to skip some of these out of time, just to get to the what do you do. The temptation, I understand, when disinformation comes out is that you want to get rid of it, you want to disprove it, you want to discredit it. But the bad news is that none of these tactics are likely to work. And this is because of everything that we've been talking about with schemas. If you eliminate information, you are addressing the symptom, but you're not getting at the real root of the problem. And it's just going to pop up again and again and again. So here's a funny example. 2 days ago, it came out that there are media channels in China banning Peppa Pig. I have a 2-year-old. I'm very familiar with Peppa Pig. And when I heard this, I could not imagine what was threatening about Peppa Pig. And I actually have projects that deal with Chinese censorship. So I was curious, what could this be? They don't cover politics in Peppa Pig. I think they had the Queen on once. That was it. Well, you know what it was or is? Somehow Peppa Pig has become a gang sign in China. So there's somebody wearing a Peppa Pig coin purse, and we've got Peppa Pig gangster tattoos. But what happens is that there's always going to be a new way to circumvent the removal of information. They'll just, if you're going to remove whatever their gang sign was before, fine, we'll find a new one. Peppa Pig. I don't know why Peppa Pig got it, but she did. And so they'll remove Peppa Pig, and it's going to be something else next week. So if that's your tactic, you're going to be playing a game of whack-a-mole. And China can't even keep up with it. And China has 12 million people, at least according to Rand Waltzman, who are involved in monitoring their social media. 12 million. Do you know that that would mean if you had every man, woman, and child in the state of Ohio sitting in front of a computer doing this work for you, you still wouldn't have 12 million. And they still can't keep up. And they're doing things like banning Peppa Pig. So that doesn't seem like a fruitful strategy. Something else that doesn't work is doing a tit for tat, trying to argue against points. And we know this from health research. So a real common thing people try to do is do like, here's the myth, here's the fact, here's the myth, here's the fact. That has been empirically demonstrated to backfire. It's a terrible way to go about convincing somebody of something. Nonetheless, here's an example from CDC, flu vaccine facts and myths. And you don't need to worry about what the specifics are there, except to show that it uses that format. And we did some research on it. And in the immediate 10 minutes following something like this, people do in fact retain information pretty well, whether they get the facts only or the facts and the myths. But if you come back a week later, if you've given them the facts only, they remember the facts pretty well. If you've given them the facts and the myths, they're worse off than if you hadn't talked to them at all. They will have a lower rating of the importance and intention to get a flu shot than a control group that you didn't talk to at all. And that's because when you exposed them to facts and myths, they remembered stuff. So when they come back here, they remember all the facts and the myths, and they don't remember which one's which. They just remember stuff. So you have actually reinforced the myths because you've just said them again. And remember, how do we get schemas? And how do things seem truthy? Because they're familiar, because you've heard them over and over. So debunking is tricky. There's actually a very good handbook on it, but in the primary thing it says is do not argue against specific points of information. You reinforce it when you do that, and you cause people to defend their worldviews, and it backfires. So what do you do instead? There are specific methods for building psychological resistance, and a really good analogy to use is sort of the physical immune system analogy. If you're in a position of trying to fight off every bit of disinformation that comes down the pike, that's what happens every year when we're trying to inoculate against the flu. And sometimes we get it, sometimes we don't. I had the flu last week. I had the flu shot, but it wasn't very good this year. Maybe some of you guys have the flu too, even though you had the flu shot. And that's because the flu mutates. And every year you have to get a new flu shot, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. Vaccinations also depend on herd immunity. Everybody has to get them so that the few people that didn't work for don't get the flu, even though they didn't get the shot. What you really need to be working on is building populations that are immune to disinformation before the disinformation gets to them. So remember at the beginning I said that the first thing you learn about a topic is very sticky. So the key to building the resistance to disinformation is you have to build resistance before the disinformation hits the targets. This means that you need to reinforce worldviews that will repel the disinformation, and it means you need to prime identities in folks that will make them disinclined to believe the disinformation that you don't want them to believe. I realize I've gone over already, so apologies for that. And I will say there are specific theories and methodologies for each of the bullets here. Inoculation. There's a long series of steps that you can go through in inoculating a population against a particular message. And it's something that you need particular training in. I wouldn't want to just throw information out there and give the impression that it's simple. It's not, but it is possible. It is something that we know how to do. We also know how to build a psychologically healthy immune system. And that means people need to feel that their worldviews are supported and that their identities are important. And so you could take the approach of trying to eliminate every bad message you see coming down the pike, or you could take the approach of building a population that it doesn't matter if those messages are there. So it's not so much that you're battling the messages, you're battling the effects of the messages and undermining the effect that they would have. So I'll stop there.
So we'll open it up for questions. I have one. Victoria, one of the things that you talked to us about is the vulnerability of children at a certain age. Mm-hmm. And you talked about the sort of physiological reasons for that and why organizations like ISIS are targeting those people online. So if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. And there is a South by Southwest video on this, so we can certainly let people see that if they'd like. Excuse me. There is a perception, I don't know how many people in here have teenage children. I have a 13-year-old, so this is very close to home right now. There is a perception that young adolescents are not logical and they're not capable. It's confusing because you see them do things that you think that makes no sense. What were you thinking? And there's also a temptation to try to talk them out of doing things by explaining to them how risky they are. And those are both misguided. And so let me explain what's actually happening. When logic is developing in the brain, it's developing in the frontal cortex, and it's trucking along pretty linearly. It's better and better every year. It starts developing in early childhood, and it gets better and better and better until you're about 22. It levels off eventually, unfortunately, goes back down. But it's pretty steady. But let's say it's here. Now something else is happening in adolescence, and that's the development of self-control. That's here. About right there. So what's happening is not that your adolescent can't reason. They can. That's why they're able to take calculus class and do it, Scrabble and things like that before you're ready. But their self-control is lagging. And there's a third thing that's happening. They are experiencing a period of their life where the thing that is, two things are very, very motivating, very, very attractive to them. Pure acceptance and pure belonging and risk. They love risk. Risk is very attractive. They will do incredibly stupid things. Not because they don't know they're dangerous, because they know they're dangerous. They wouldn't do them if they weren't dangerous. They would be bored. So when you find yourself tempted, whether it's warning European girls not to go off and join ISIS, or trying to get your 13-year-old not to drive a BMX off the roof, explaining the risk doesn't make sense. They know the risk. They know the risk. That's not going to demotivate them. What would demotivate them was making it seem uncool in some way, making it seem boring. Those are the kinds of things that demotivate you. I mean, what is the worst thing for an adolescent, right? To be like caught dead with their parents on a Saturday night. That's awful. They don't like boring. They don't like being seen to be conforming, which is odd because they're super conforming, but they don't like to be seen that way. So there's a very interesting mix of things that are going on there. And remember, the self-control is developing, but it doesn't catch up to support logic very well until the late adolescent years. It's a little later in boys than in girls. In girls, it's obviously huge individual differences, but 16, 17, 18, and in boys, it's like more like college age. And that's when you kind of finally see that logic now seems to be moving behavior more so than the drive for risk and fear affiliation. Does that sort of along those lines? Yeah.
Another question?
Mm-hmm.
I have two questions. First, you talked about stereotype threat.
Mhm.
Are there scenarios where you said America's very cohesive, same flow, same home, people tend to have a highly structured, like, cohesive, I'll just say cohesive.
Mhm.
Are there scenarios, perhaps in minority groups, where it's very different from that and people react differently to stereotype threat as a result?
Yeah, and so for first off, when I say that as Americans we have a more cohesive self-identity, that varies in the U.S. and it's less so in minority groups. A lot of minority groups have there are different subcultures in the U.S. and a lot of minority groups have more collectivist inclination to the kind of average American identity. So just that in and of itself, yes. So you will see differences there. I'm not sure if I quite understood the rest of the question.
So you mentioned stereotype threat, and you remind people of a stereotype about their subgroup,
Yeah.
well, inform whether or not has any basis.
Yes.
Has nothing to do with it. You just seem to connect that with the cohesiveness of American society in general. Does a less cohesive society have an even more dramatic result or a less dramatic result? I guess.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, it's more.
More dramatic.
It's more exaggerated because they have larger shifts in their mindset between their identities. So for you, your identity as a woman and your identity as, I don't know what your job is, but let's just pretend you're not physician. You know, they're pretty close. As an American, you've got a pretty cohesive identity. But in a different culture, they might be further apart. You might think more differently in your woman mindset than in your mathematician.
Okay.
So it will tend to exaggerate those kinds of differences. And that can be a tool that you can use to encourage people to act one way or another by shifting the way that they're thinking of themselves. But it's also something to watch out for. So when you're observing messages out there in the world, you need to think about where are people taking in and in what mindset are they likely sitting when these messages are coming to them, because that will impact them in the way that they're filtering through the messages.
Okay, thank you. I have one other question. I know that there are different groups of people whose ratings for behavior and expert, particularly thinking of autism spectrum and things like that, where they are less likely to follow social convention or even unable to use them. How does that affect these, for example, susceptibility to social lies, or lies, everything you're talking about? How does that affect this? Are they less and more susceptible, or does it vary too much?
That's really interesting. I don't think there's a blanket answer. I think it would depend on each of the, so there's schemas are still going to work for them, for example, at a core level. But when it comes to something like social conformity, then a schema will not work for them in the same way as it will work for somebody else. So there's not going to be a pat answer. I think it's going to depend on what you're asking. Excuse me. Do you have a particular question in mind, or?
I would probably just prefer
Okay, that's fine. Sure. Yeah.
I was curious about the role of humor in all of this, because you showed some examples, but at least in my social media world, I feel like that's a big role in TV.
Yeah, I've actually thought, I haven't pitched this yet, but I've been working on the idea of using humor to reverse engineer people's mindsets, actually. I think it's very revealing of how someone is thinking of the world if you know what they think is funny, right? So I would put humor for persuasion in the same category as storytelling, though, which is that when you get somebody into a less critical mindset, they're more open-minded to new ideas. And one way to do that is in storytelling, and humor is part of this. So if you are able to, actually, let me step back and think of the term is narrative engagement. Have you ever been so into a story, maybe you're reading, for example, you kind of become a little bit less aware of your real situation, your real surroundings, so into the story. And sometimes you look up, you're almost surprised, like, oh my gosh, I'm still here in my living room. It got dark, and I didn't even notice. That's being super involved in the story. And humor is part of that too, because in order to find something funny, you have to go into the experience. You have to step into the little world of the joke. And when that happens, the part of your brain that judges becomes a little bit quieter. And I've actually been worked with Georgia Tech and put people on an MRI scanner and show movies and watch this happen. Part of your brain that judges things, that says, nope, that's not true, that's not right, that gets a little bit quieter. And it has to, because you can't enjoy jokes and stories if you're constantly picking them apart. You hate watching movies with that guy, right? You know, you have to make that part of your brain shut up so that you can enjoy the story. And when you do that, you actually are a little more open-minded to all kinds of things. So there's a lot of evidence that introducing new ideas through story environments works better than just throwing it at something like a policy. And I think humor works in that way too. And it's also engaging, and you, when you're in a happier mood and you have endorphins, that's a different mindset, and you're actually more accepting and less judgmental of what somebody is telling you.
This is fantastic. Put a couple resources up on the screen. I'm curious what would you recommend for us? One of the take another step in learning score. Is there a psychological resilience dummies book? Something else that
You know,
could take that step?
not yet. Well, there is, but not. If you look that up, it won't be this stuff. I tried just in case. It comes up with, like, you know, if you were abused as a child, how to get over it, which is important, but not what you're asking. So maybe a bit of pop out, but I'd say come talk to me because I have a lot of more information. I pulled things from here from like a range of different sort of courses that I teach. And as I mentioned, that there's a lot more to cover, but it has to kind of be tailored to the topics. But I will tell you that there are groups, and John mentioned this, and it's becoming more and more apparent that we need to focus on this in defense. I went to a meeting last year where I believe this is still going to happen, that the DOD is looking at setting up, and that's not the acronym, it's an acronym, it's a joint command for information operations. So they're looking at setting up. And so that would be a huge move. And that's going to put a lot of import behind efforts to pull together research like this. Because the research, there is a lot of research out there to show you how to build resistance, but it's not done on Russian disinformation. It's done in psych labs, and so the person that needs to get it doesn't know where to look. And so I feel like this is one of my parts of the community. I understand some of the operational concerns. I also understand the academic role in trying what I'm trying to do all together. So there isn't a book. There isn't a book out there yet, but that is something that we need. There's also a new group called the Information Professionals Association. I mentioned Rand Waltzman earlier. He's one of the founders, and he's actually calling for. His name is Rand. He works at Rand. He used to be a DARPA PM who ran one of their larger programs on social media manipulation. 3 or 4 years ago that concluded. And he's calling for basically a Manhattan project of disinformation. So he believes that we need something of that level to develop the kind of understanding and expertise to operationalize decades of psychological research out there, but it's all done with college students. And to turn that into things that could be useful to our communities. And so it's a recognized need that people are kind of just now getting moving on. I know this is a question. But I can give you specific journal results, but I don't know if that's, what's useful. Yeah.
So you mentioned building a psychological resistance, but at the same time, the truthiness of information, disinformation, is increased with fear first. How do you develop a psychological resistance when the first information you hear
That's right. So there's two possible, I think of it in two ways. One, there could be a technological solution, which I kind of feel like is a bit of a Band-Aid, but is a faster thing that we might need to focus on in the short term. And that is if we can identify that information and shut it down before it gets to a broad audience, we'll be able to get ahead of it a little sooner. The problem is the reason disinformation is so easy to spread is because it's so fast. It's easy to be fast if you don't have to tell the truth. I can make up anything and put it out there in 2 minutes, right? It's very easy. So if an event happens in the world, an airplane goes down, something goes up someplace, and I want to spread disinformation, I can do it like that. If I want to tell the truth, it's going to take me days, maybe weeks to figure out what really happened and get the truth out there. And way too late by then. So you know, if you can stop the information before it gets to people, that will help. But that's only going to be a Band-Aid. It's going to be way too easy for people to get that out. The other thing that would be a longer term, where I'm talking about psychological resistance, is that remember that even if something is first, it will kind of bounce off of you if it doesn't fit with your worldview. So it matters very much that it's first, but it also matters very much how it matches up with your worldview. And it isn't really the first thing you're encountering if you already have a worldview that repels it. So where I'm going with that is that if you want to have an example, one of the messages that extremist groups will put out is that there's like this narrative of a war on Islam, and that people will grow up kind of feeling that way. So then when information comes in that seems to support that, it's easily incorporated into that schema. But if they didn't have that worldview, if they had a worldview that countered that, even when the new bits of information came in real fast, they would bounce off. They wouldn't be incorporated because they wouldn't fit the schema. So now that is not easy. That's something and that's why I show that example with the gay marriage example. I understand that that's not something that's going to happen in one messaging campaign. It's something that has to be built up over years and years. But that's something that unfortunately the U.S. is not as good at as our adversaries. China and Russia will promote the same narrative for decades. Everything is consistent with those narratives. And they've got really well set worldviews that maybe can now play into. And we're not in that position. We're not. And so we have worldviews, but they're more of a greater variety. We don't understand them as well. And we are more vulnerable to disinformation because of that. One more? Oh, sorry.
I was just going to ask, have you looked at the recent events with the North Korea, South Korea now sort of getting together when it seemed initially, tensions were high and were flying out?
Yeah.
So have you sort of looked into sort of the cause, and then secondly, what is the effect perhaps on North Koreans who have looked at their world as sort of self-deluded and Korea now?
That's a really, I haven't looked at it in any empirical way, but I've certainly been thinking about it. And one thing, first of all, I didn't actually even thought about the impact on the North Koreans because I don't know what they know about it. Do we even know if they know what's happening? I don't know. I mean, that's a legitimate question. I don't know. I don't know how it's being portrayed to them. I don't know what they thought has been happening. So that I can't even begin to wrap my head around because I don't know what worldview they have. But as for the other interesting dynamic is that on one hand, it would seem super surprising that all of a sudden they would come together. But on the other hand, you have to remember that the country has only been split since the 50s. They're Koreans. They're all Koreans. And so the things that I tell you about like worldviews and sacred values, they have a lot more in common with each other than say South Korea does with us. Even though we kind of think, oh, South Korea is our ally and North Korea is this crazy adversary, and actually they're very similar in deep fundamental ways and very different from us. They probably understand each other in ways that we don't get. It's like us in England, you know. And even though they've had, I guess technically there's still a war, and obviously a lot of hostilities and tensions over the years, there is underneath that a way for them to understand each other that is a way that we're not going to understand them. So think of that side of it too. But it's a really interesting dynamics to talk about.
Oh, we can talk about this all day, but we all have to get back to our day job. So thank you all. Thank you. Awesome. Yeah.
That sounds great, right? But then, you know, you ask about it, you send out a message that they're not okay. At the same time, the people that have this world view, if you're giving a tradition a more, right? So you have this kind of, you're gonna help them make this work.